I'm here as the moderator for session number 26, which is Restorative Justice for Mass Atrocity Crimes. The session was organized by the LWM Global Virtual Conference on Commemorating Past Genocides and Learning to Prevent Atrocity Crimes. My name is Ken McLean, and I'm a professor at Clark University in the United States, and I'm affiliated with the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. We have 3 speakers today, 2 of whom will be joining us in person via Zoom, and 1 who could not make it but prepared a presentation, which I will share online when it is her turn. I'm going to announce or introduce each of our speakers in turn and give you a very brief bio and the title name as I have it. And they have approximately 15 minutes to present their materials in turn, which once done will leave us approximately 15 minutes for Q&A, which I will help facilitate. So I invite and encourage and implore our speakers to stick strictly to the time limit so everyone has time, including our audience, to raise questions with us. So with that being said, I will begin with our first speaker. His name is John Hubble-Weiss. Before assuming emeritus status at Cornell University in 2019, John taught courses in the US, France, Bosnia, and South Korea on a range of topics, including the history of humanitarianism and human rights. He continues his work on genocide memorialization and prevention through a range of NGOs in Bosnia, Darfur, Greece, Tanzania, the Rohingya crisis, and so on. It's a very long list, and his work is impressive, and I hope you follow up with him. The paper title is A Proposal for a Critical Survey of Formats to Commemorate Genocide and to Prevent Atrocity Crimes. If you pause and give me 1 moment, I believe that has arrived. And yes, I have a document from John, and I will share the screen and allow him to take it away. John, the floor is yours.
Okay, I've unmuted, so that should work. Ken, let me get my timer out here. Make sure, okay, that I don't run over. My working hypothesis in this proposal is that actions past the potential designed to commemorate and prevent genocides and atrocity crimes have weaknesses and strengths, both intellectual and technical, for which analytical frameworks can be designed. Some of the venues on which these problems are confronted are listed at the bottom. Some of the questions that could guide these frameworks are suggested here right now. In giving examples at each of these points as we go down, I will emphasize the problems that I discern in the past actions, but at the same time, I certainly appreciate the dedication, imagination, and hard work those wishing to remember the crime of crimes and to prevent its recurrence. The first topic would be language. Activists often confront the problem of terminology. The use of genocide as the term designating the action opposed, the crime to be commemorated, produces arguments with regard to the measurement of the degree of intent. Terms can be adapted, although they have no presence in criminal statutes, and were coined by perpetrators of the genocide. That's a second example. A term like ethnic cleansing. Knowledge of the modification and slippage of terms as it occurs in various forms of writing for general audiences can clarify questions such as how ethnic cleansing became genocide light to some advocates, and for others a matter for textbook examples, but not court action. Arguments over genocide definitions, for example, may be decisive in the final judgment of the ICJ concerning Myanmar's action against Rohingya, just as the question of the varieties of intent has been in the past. Second, got a line for an analysis. The terminology applied to the victim group poses another puzzle. The UN Genocide Convention refers to national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. but the identity of the victim group is not always clear. Different authorities produce different numbers of tribes in Darfur, as a group of mine found out when the President's Special Envoy on Darfur asked us to give a report on the social structure of Darfur. Another example, the definition of Tutsi was crystallized not by culture, but by an ID card. Actions during and after a genocidal conflict often move to celebrate, strengthen, or sometimes weaken the cultures under attack. There's another thing one has to watch for. A Mandolin in Exile, that wonderful film by Rafikael Anwar Russell in 2020, released in 2020, shows the pre-existing unhappiness of conservative Muslim elders with this rebel mandolin player. One has to take, therefore, into consideration these kinds of divisions in a culture, and one should. Third line of attack for analysis, the political structures in which the anti-genocide actions take place need to be fully understood. Mobilizing citizen groups to demonstrate against the Bashir regime came to a peak in April 30th, 2006. The Darfur Peace Agreement was signed by only one rebel group on May 5th, 2006, less than a week later. And those assembled in Washington in the largest Darfur demonstration were told that they had brought it about. They were told that it was about to be signed on April 30th, and everybody knew that, and they were told that they had brought it about. Okay, and that it would in fact be an effective peace. The relationship, but it wasn't. The relationship of citizen groups or legislatures to executive powers tend to be shifting, tenuous, and arbitrary. Congress voted 4 times to lift the embargo against Bosnia, but the Clinton administration's conception of the US role, as opposed to that of the European powers, confined it to indirect and surreptitious means of assisting the Bosnian government. So you were sitting there as an activist and suddenly things just weren't working out, but you didn't really have an idea why they didn't work out and why, in fact, something was done. You see, we got a shifting, okay, we got a little bit, okay, here, number 4. The relationship between human rights organizations and humanitarian organizations can impact planning for justice outcomes, as it has in the past. One has to watch what is happening there. Examples are individual cases like the MSF, Doctors Without Borders, staff worker who witnesses a crime and is asked to testify against a perpetrator. That is a really tense situation. It doesn't always come out in favor of justice, one might say. Or the humanitarian aid organization, members of the Save Darfur Coalition, who fired its director when he asked for a no-fly zone in a New York Times advertisement. Therefore, the director being on the side of human rights, and one might say also anti-genocide work, and the humanitarian aid organization members having a different approach to matters. Number 5, an evaluator of the counter-genocide effort needs to be sensitive to weaknesses of the powerful instruments listed below, the ones that are on this screen. You'll see films and videos, where the focus of such analyzing and reporting lies can prove especially important. I've chose one of the more elaborate examples here. Emphasis upon the imprisonment of Aung San Suu Kyi in Myanmar, combined with the argument that Myanmar had nevertheless been creeping toward democracy with the constitutional changes of 2011, risked leaving viewers and readers unable to appreciate the age, scope, and power of the Tatmadaw, that's the Burmese military's brutality. Little attention has been given in such media to the ethnic groups on the country's periphery who had been the victims of settlement or interrupted campaigns since the founding of Burma. Again, another example. According to diplomats interviewed on American television, the level of violence deployed by Burmese troops in recent weeks has not yet reached the level of violence of 1988 or 2007. There was no further comment on that, like, okay, now what can we expect? Okay, let's see if Ken, if you can move it down a little bit here. And we'll move it. Oh, let's see. Okay, you're right. Okay, hold it there. Right. Number 6, finally, there's a need for sensitivity to innovative instruments, which both, I'm trying to check my time here anyway, which both examine the actions and attitudes of the activists themselves and use that dialogue, in fact, to, with audiences to sharpen their own visions. We have an example here on the reflections of 2 young playwrights, Aidan Ardine and Trevor Stankiewicz, who were playwrights and first wrote a play about Darfur, in which they did the same thing. They were looking at the hesitations of activists, as well as doing a kind of direct and one might say standard attack on the genocide going in Darfur and on Bashir's regime. They combined both those things in the play and in a talk back afterwards at the play. This was at Cornell in their first performance. The Wrong Place is another play, a part documentary and part imagined play surrounding the international response to the Rohingya genocide, using testimonials and interviews, and this is the way they put it, and something they sent me last night actually. Real people interact with fictional characters to reflect on questions regarding allyship, intention, and activism. And this is, again, an account of their experience and one that one should take into account in assessing the real power, I think, of traveling plays, you might say, or perhaps even plays on an international Zoom as well with feedback. The thin line between nationalism and patriotism, issues surrounding Islamophobia, and the weaponization of social media as a tool for hate are eerily familiar as they uncover more, that is, as the playwrights uncover more of it. They question their role in both the events of this story as well as the telling of it. They reflect on whether they are actually making a difference or just want to receive credit for trying it. The play is performed and immediately followed by a talkback, helping to foster the interest of the viewers of the play and to help them understand and connect with the issue. And that's what they've been doing for the last, 4 or 5 years. The play also allows for moments of joy, ensuring that the Rohingya are viewed as people to appreciate and not simply statistics to pity. It is this human element that remains with the audience after seeing the piece. This is the way, again, Aidan and Trevor have put it as well, the way they propose to people. And they're going to go on, they're going to continue modifying the play according to the feedback they get from audiences as well as others. Now I want to turn to the list of some formats for commemorative and preventive action. And my clock says I have about 4.5 minutes. And so this is just a list of them for you to think about and think about how you would assess the effectiveness and the problems that are involved in using these particular instruments. Museum buildings with grounds for monuments and equipped with communications equipment are, of course, the fundamental sort of instrument that one uses for both commemoration and also for prevention by the ceremonies, by the things one puts up. I was struck by the kind of ways that certain museums can produce innovations as well. The first place I ever saw, in fact, the genocide against the Herero and the Nama in German Southwest Africa in 1904 was in the museum in Gisozi, which was constructed, I believe, I'm not sure exactly, I think in I'm not sure exactly when that museum was constructed, but it was certainly after 1994, in which it had then a display on that particular genocide, which had, as far as I know, had not been covered before. Second, online sites of memory, such as you're going to see, which illustrate the possibilities of this online museum format, and also may mention some of the difficulties of it. At least Rachel could mention them to you. Then number 3, a large category that I really could write an awful lot about, feature-length nonfiction films and videos, as well as short videos, nonfiction TV video presentations, and nonfiction spot news reports. Each requires a separate analysis as well, and an understanding of how they could get a kind of iconic status, such as the well-known documentary about what is important about World War II and the fate of people in concentration camps, Their Night and Fog by Alain René. Number 4 are Twitter accounts, podcasts, and social media, such as Facebook, notorious in the Myanmar case as a demonizer. Number 5, plays staged before a passive audience raise questions different from that of those followed by audience actor discussions, which is what, of course, happens with the plays that Trevor and Aidan put on. Number 6, rarely attempted, complicated, but highly important international collaborations among artists coming from groups playing different opposing roles in an ongoing genocide, offers a most promising new format for memorialization and prevention. And I'll leave you wondering what I'm referring to, because in fact, that is the brainchild of the founder of the Liberation War Museum, Mofidul Hook, and it is for him to go further with that and satisfy your curiosity. Number 7, a possible venue for such collaborations provided by nationwide ceremonial periods of remembrance and by people's tribunals, certainly. Number 8 is observatories and documentation centers range widely in their ability to act as centers of activist mobilization, lobbying, or access to high-level policymakers, a variability that needs critical analysis. These centers are very, very different, and the level of funding doesn't explain always those differences. Number 9, the memorialization and prevention effectiveness of the forms of legal and academic scholarship as it is found in textbooks, legal journals, court arguments, nationally marketed curricula, and local course curricula also need to be critically analyzed. All kinds of questions come up, both large, such as the general interpretations of genocides running through them, and also small, but not so small, such as why, in fact, people putting out textbooks on genocides often charge really high prices and force those of us trying to use them into all kinds of devices of recopying and putting online and getting permissions and these kinds of things we shouldn't have to do quite so much. Both classroom teachers and activists engaging in various forms of public education remain consumers of this intellectual product coming from the law journals and the textbook writers and other writers. Let us pray that they remain well fed. Just made it, Ken.
Yes, you did. Perfect, John. Thank you. That was a great overview of some of the key issues and examples for people to follow up. I'm going to shift to our next speaker, who is not here with us in person, unfortunately, but she did prepare a video, and I will share the screen momentarily after I tell you about her. Her name is Rachel Chung. She's a senior program associate at Results for Development, a DC-based global development firm. And she has a program in digital strategy and project management and has worked on a range of education policies across sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. The title of her talk is Reframing the Narrative for the Rohingya Diaspora. It was a partnership she carried out with students from the Graduate School of Education at Harvard University and the Liberation War Museum. She co-designed the website, for which you will get a sneak peek, to raise awareness about the Rohingya and to encourage action from the international community. I'm about to share my screen and we'll watch it together.
Hello, excuse me. We can't hear anything. Can you share sound while you are actually sharing the video? While you are sharing your screen, you will see an option, share sound. You'll have to tick that option. You can stop the sharing, then try again. I can make this happen, all right? You can see while sharing an option, share sound. Tick that, and after that, most probably you can hear it.
Conference on Protection and Accountability in Burma in 2019. It is a question that struck me as I sat in the audience. After all human beings seek a place and a safe space to belong. The question lingered with me as I began to correspond with the Liberation War Museum and started my graduate studies in education policy at Harvard. During that time, I partnered with several of my classmates to dive into research on the Rohingya diaspora, including their access to education around the world, and also how to best raise their voices to the top of the global conversation that is about them. So today, the first part of my presentation will cover our lessons learned from research and interviews. Ultimately, our research culminated in the development of an online museum exhibit entitled The Thread Exhibit, which became all the more relevant once the COVID-19 pandemic began to spread around the world and in-person activities were no longer a possibility. I will walk you all through this Art for Justice exhibit we developed in the second part of my presentation. Before getting started, I just wanted to add two caveats. The first is that the opinions expressed in this presentation are my own and my classmates' own. We want to make it clear that we are not speaking for the Rohingya diaspora. We speak on behalf of our research as students and the opportunities that we have had to learn from other Rohingya and those that have worked with them. Second, the majority of our research was conducted in 2020 before the COVID pandemic. So my colleagues and I recognize that the situation in Myanmar and for Rohingya refugees around the world has drastically shifted from then. The word refugee is powerful. Unpacking the layers of this identity reveals an entire history of global human rights politics and presents a portrait of crisis and displacement. While the term refugee is universal in its recognition and the rights conferred to those who bear it, the collective realities of these individuals are very complex. Refugees tend to be categorized within particular contexts, but beneath, there is a depth to the story that is often not recognized. In this presentation, I seek to capture some of those nuances surrounding the identity of the Rohingya diaspora around the world, hoping to look at ways in which their narrative can be reframed by the global community and reclaimed by the Rohingya themselves. Displaced but not alone. Due to a slow-burning genocide and decades of human rights violations against the Rohingya in Myanmar, over 1 million individuals have been displaced all over the world. This map depicts some of the locations, including Bangladesh, Malaysia, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, the US, the UK, Australia, and elsewhere. While the international focus and narrative have been predominantly on Myanmar and Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, where the largest number of Rohingya have fled. The Rohingya exist in pockets of communities situated across the globe. Rohingya activists based in Bangladesh have expressed concerns about how the international community, including the humanitarian aid agencies, fail to listen to the Rohingya refugees when making overarching policy decisions that will shape their futures. Although this global diaspora is connected, they have quickly become invisible to much of the international community, Their voices are veiled by the situation of statelessness, and they are individuals forced by the lack of recognition and autonomy to exist at the margins. No schools, but still learning. In Myanmar, Bangladesh, and Malaysia, where some of the largest Rohingya communities reside, children are unable to access the formal education structures afforded to national citizens. Reflecting the unwillingness of these countries to recognize the rights of the Rohingya, the education structures available to the diaspora in these areas point to their statelessness and marginalization. The implications are severe. In Myanmar, for example, only 54% of Rohingya children have completed 1 year of school, in stark contrast to 92% of the majority ethnic group in the region. Until recently, Bangladesh prohibited Rohingya children in Cox's Bazar from accessing formal education, grounded in the stance that Rohingya refugees will not be allowed to remain in the country long-term and should eventually repatriate to Myanmar. Despite these barriers, there is cautious optimism that opportunities for the Rohingya to participate in formal education structures outside of Myanmar will continue to grow incrementally. Within the refugee camps of Bangladesh, NGOs are providing informal education to refugee children in the camps of Cox's Bazar. Prior to COVID, 300,000 Rohingya children and adolescents studied at over 3,200 learning centers, 70% of which are operated by UNICEF. In January of 2020, the government of Bangladesh and UNICEF agreed in principle upon a policy that will permit Rohingya children up to the age of 14 to receive formal education. But of course, with the widespread effects of COVID, all camp activities have been halted, as well as the implementation of this policy. To supplement available informal education, the Rohingya people have made efforts to educate their community and communicate with the world. Considering the varying levels of access to technology across refugee populations, digital tools are not the sole solution to achieving equitable opportunities for education. However, technology does play a significant role in enhancing learning for the Rohingya. For example, an online Rohingya learning center founded by a youth leader in India has taught English and life skills to students through YouTube. Social media platforms also support the formation of connections amongst the global diaspora. Rohingya School comprises of a team of 15 individuals, including a few members who are Rohingya, and is in the early stages of designing a mobile app and multilingual classroom resources for schools, allowing Rohingya to learn their own language through EdTech. Through Rohingya School's social media accounts, they're interacting with teenagers who have been using their native language. Not pity, but empowerment. Leveraging local and global relationships within the diaspora has proven to be essential for refugee diasporas in their pursuit of opportunities and justice. For instance, the diaspora in Australia has continued to engage in political activities against the human rights abuses occurring in Myanmar, organizing meetings and workshops to raise awareness about the Rohingya. In response to the November 2019 International Court of Justice case against Myanmar, the Burmese Rohingya community in Australia organized a protest calling upon the government and international community to take on an active role in ending the genocide. The video of this protest has been viewed on Facebook over 20,000 times. Across members of a diaspora, a common vision is often shared regarding their country of origin. For one individual that we interviewed who worked closely with Rohingya children, they shared that there were often wistful sentiments of, "I wish I lived there too," when they heard the stories and memories shared by other classmates who grew up in Myanmar. This collective memory and identity can serve as the foundation for new and powerful community-led initiatives. Yet, the lack of recognition for the Rohingya undermines their ability to form community and harness the momentum of their global diaspora. For the international community, a call to action thus remains: to do what is within its means to shift the global narrative for the Rohingya from one of victimhood and pity to dignity and respect. Much of our takeaways from this research is reflected in the thread exhibit, which you can also access at threadexhibit.com. We developed this site in partnership with the Liberation War Museum and Harvard Asia Center. So I will go ahead and take us there now. The website includes an online quilt exhibit that showcases artwork made by Rohingya women living in Cox's Bazar. My colleagues and I are aware that this is the Rohingya stories to tell, and will continue to ask for feedback from Rohingya contexts on this website and ensure that we are representing them well. I will close out my presentation by explaining why we chose to call the exhibit thread. Art has the potential to connect individual stories across time and space. The Rohingya artwork on this website adds to a growing tapestry of remembrances and aspirations, a tapestry that will grow and hopefully contribute to the ongoing fight for justice for the Rohingya. Thank you so much for your time.
All right, welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed that. My apologies for the sound issue at the very beginning, but I think we solved that. I'd like to move on to our third and final speaker, and then we will move into the Q&A section of the panel. The final speaker is Teresa De Langues, or De Langues, forgive my pronunciation, who's an independent scholar. She is the immediate past director of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies and Associate Professor in Global Affairs and Humanities at American University of Phnom Penh, where she teaches genocide studies, peace and conflict resolution, as well as issues related to gender and development. Her primary research focuses on the Cambodian genocide, as well as sexual violence in armed conflict and mass atrocity, with a focus on using oral history methodologies. She has published in a variety of venues, and her academic work and advocacy has been recognized internationally for its impact on access to justice for survivors of wartime sexual violation. Her talk, is entitled Just Listening, Non-Judicial Truth-Telling, and Survivors of Sexual Violence During Genocide. I am going to open up the slides I received from her. And Teresa, will you simply tell me when you want me to change slides? Is that how you would like it to work?
I actually was going to ask if I can perhaps share my screen, because it looks like I can do that.
All right, when I click on share screen, it doesn't, let me see, I'll check participants.
Oh, let me try to share my screen.
Okay, go ahead. It doesn't give me the option on my end. Wonderful. The floor is yours.
Okay, perfect. So now I just have to figure out how to get it to full. This is just not what I wanted to do. Okay, so now let me start the slideshow. All right, perfect. Okay, so so let me just get my comments. So first of all, I just want to express my gratitude for being part of this marathon session. I'm so impressed, and so as always, just really grateful for the work of the Liberation War Museum in memorializing, making sure that we don't ever forget genocides and how they happen, and how we have to constantly be asking the question of prevention. So congratulations on this incredible feat in the midst of a really dark period, and we really need to be having these conversations right now. So to Mofidal and the staff over at the museum, thanks so much. My presentation today is a little bit, it's quite descriptive, maybe a little bit like Rachel's, in that I'm talking about a women's hearing that took place in Cambodia that was around sexual violence during conflict throughout the Asia Pacific. And it was really, falls within the category of non-judicial truth-telling forums that have become really important venues to raise victims' voices while formal judicial mechanisms are unwilling or unable to deliver justice for certain survivors. And gender-based violence has continually been one of those crimes during genocide and mass atrocity that has been excluded. And so this was an opportunity in 2012 for an NGO, a local NGO in Cambodia, to convene the Asia Pacific Regional Women's Hearing on Gender-Based Violence During Conflict. And in doing so, gathering 10 women survivors, testifiers from Cambodia, Timor-Leste, Nepal, and Bangladesh to share their stories at a public hearing before an estimated audience of about 250 government officials, court officers, because at the time, Cambodia was actually having a war crimes tribunal, the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. There were also academics there, international activists, and students. And in each of these cases of the 4 countries, there were actually 2 women that came, and they were supported by psychosocial support by 2 others who came. So that was there was a delegation of 4 for each of the countries to make sure that victims were supported in this process before, during, and after. And in each of those cases, the sexual crimes that had been committed as part of the distinct conflict had been neglected or sidelined in some way from formal justice processes. And so these women and women like them had been effectively excluded from transitional justice processes and redress as outlined in the UN Basic Principles and Guidelines from on the right to remedy and reparations, a fundamental document for transitional justice. While not a replacement for prosecutions and convictions in the formal courts as part of official transitional justice mechanisms, this non-judicial informal women's hearing offered an alternative location for victims to access a form of reparative justice that responded to the lived realities of survivors who are still having to exist in communities that ostracize and fault them for the crimes committed against them. During the hearing, a message of solidarity was also sent as part of the event from the Guatemalan Women's Court of Conscience and read aloud as a reminder to all of us who were gathered there that this is a global women's movement and that this sort of thing was happening to women around the world. Modeled after people's tribunals, in particular the Tokyo Women's Tribunal for Japan's military sexual slavery, the format of the Asia Pacific Women's Hearing that took place in 2012 in Cambodia had a much broader structure and allowed for testifiers to present their experiences before a panel of experts in their own time, on their own terms, and free from the formal procedural and evidentiary rules that often constrain and sometimes even silence or re-traumatize victims when they come forward. Legal scholar Diane Otto served on the panel, and she also reflected on how these kinds of people's tribunals evoke what she calls a politics of listening, a listening that educates about the complex causes of conflict and violence, and that prompts acknowledgement of the responsibilities of those who are listening and encourages solidarity and action toward change. People's tribunals demand this politics of listening, looking to realize that justice is both in and beyond the law and based on our common experience of loss and vulnerability. Such justice does not rely on state authorization to give it validity or even vivacity, but it presents a compelling challenge towards a tendency to see that justice only resides in the courts, or that criminal prosecutions are the main theater for anti-impunity activism. In what I'm calling, in a heavy adaptation of Diane Otto's Politics of Listening, is a kind of just listening. A People's Tribunal doesn't have any legal efficacy, let's say. Its conclusions are non-binding, and what it does is precisely, by listening, it opens up new space for new rights to emerge and new ways to protect those rights to be formulated. It does that simply by listening, and by listening, validating. The Asia Pacific Women's Hearing is such a case. It provided an alternative venue to formal justice mechanisms, primarily courts and tribunals, to manifest justice for victims whose experiences of injustice have not been recognized, have not yet been fully recognized by formal systems of law. This is especially important for sexual violence survivors who not only continue to be silenced and stigmatized and blamed for their violations in communities, but usually in court told this wasn't a crime, or it's not covered by the law, or even if it was a crime, it didn't rise to the level of a crime. There's actually an example I'll talk about in a moment about that. The hearing not only protested the inadequacies of existing law to address the many variations of women's experiences and men's experiences of sexual violence, but also served to insert these voices within the purview of law. In breaking decades of silence, the testifiers at the women hearing publicly and effectively shifted blame and shame from themselves as victims to where reproach rightfully belonged, the perpetrators. And in resituating the justice terrain away from the courts and toward the community of listeners who had gathered and who had centered the victims in order to recognize and acknowledge their truth of suffering, the responsibility for justice and satisfaction expanded beyond the state and its institutions, and instead implicated larger society, all of us, in our readiness to catalyze cultural transformation that addresses the root cause of exclusion, disempowerment, and marginalization, and ultimately is a precursor to such things as conflict and genocide. Such justice depends on a kind of listening that evokes our common humanity. So let me show you some slides of the actual event, which I think better than words might even give you an idea of what was happening at this hearing. I'm not really sure, how much time do I have?
You're coming right up to the end. If you can wrap it up fairly soon so we have time for questions, that would be wonderful.
So the hearing was Asia Pacific regional, although the first hearing had started in Cambodia, and and then the second year it grew to include these other countries. This is the panel of experts in terms of being able to receive the stories that women were telling. And this is the Tribunal Conscious, the women's hearing from Guatemala that sent their regards to us. And this is the first delegation. This is Cambodia. They were a perfect example of really having to insert themselves in order to be covered by the formal law. And these hearings were really advocacy efforts for the formal tribunal to see that forced marriage was in fact a crime that should be prosecuted, as well as other crimes that ended up not getting prosecuted. For example, forced pregnancy and rape outside of forced marriage. This young woman is from Nepal. And she basically was talking about how now she cannot ever be married again, that the consequences, again, are not just economic or legal, but there's a deep social consequence to sexual violence, especially for women, that lingers for a very long time. This is the Bangladesh delegation. You can see she has her psychosocial support with her. She asked this question about how do we repair victims of sexual violence, which is very culturally laden, right? That in itself, the way, not just that we stigmatize as a society, but that we put so much value on chastity and purity for women, that rape becomes sexual violence becomes almost irreparable. And then we have the women from Timor-Leste who really focused on the fact that we need to be looking outside the law, the court, as punishment, and to society and the state at large, to be so that we can make sure that victims are living with peace and dignity in their basic needs. This is the audience. Someone from the audience, people started to get up and share their own stories, which was really powerful. And then this is just one of the many psychosocial events that happened both to prepare the women, to support them during the testimony, and also afterwards. So that the process was in some ways part of the product of bringing justice to these women. So I will end there. And if anyone has questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Teresa. The just listening concept is a fascinating one and a new one to me, and I greatly enjoyed learning about your work. We have about 10 minutes, give or take, for Q&A. I have a couple in my box already. If you have questions for any of these speakers, well, for John and Teresa, since Rachel is not present, please type them in and I will read them on your behalf. The first question, I believe, John, is to you. It begins nicely with greetings from Bangladesh. The question for you is, how would you evaluate the feasibility of the people's tribunals apart from the existing criminal justice mechanism? What do they offer that criminal justice mechanisms do not? Why are they desirable or beneficial in your opinion?
I think Teresa could also answer that in the sense that she has also been conducting a people's tribunal. I've never conducted one, only seen them, read about them very indirectly. So it's difficult to answer, but I think I could work up a series of ways to evaluate them, which would take into account the respect given to the people who were there as plaintiffs, one might say, as well as witnesses, just as Teresa has talked about that very impressively. I think that'd be one thing I would look at as well. Also, the substitution factor is one that I was thinking about as Teresa was talking. In other words, you can have a people's tribunal. Does that mean that the people who committed the crimes referred to at the tribunal are therefore exempt, like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission? Like, are they exempt then from further punishment if they tell the truth or whatever, to go the way a tribunal, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission does? So I find that would be certainly one thing. And I could think of other ones. It's a good question. I'd like to get a chance to answer that more, but I think right now that's certainly one thing that does occur to me, as well as some of the obvious ones, such as the amount of publicity that it gets and the power that it has and that kind of thing.
Wonderful. Thank you, John. Teresa, would you like to speak to it from your experience and research?
Well, I do think that first of all, I do want to make sure that I think this, I said this, but I want to stress that informal mechanisms I'm not trying to argue that they should replace, but in some cases they can supplement or they can pressure the formal system so that the formal system will move in a direction that's more responsive to victims. But I think in answer to the question, you know, the thing about people's hearings, but also let's say the art exhibit of Rachel, there's these, that if we could see that justice and satisfaction can come from a broader category, that we have the power to activate and vitalize and validate for victims and survivors, then the possibilities are things like non-judicial people's tribunals, art performances. You know, in Cambodia, the reparation for forced marriage is a classical dance opera. So that tells those stories based on oral histories that we collected. So justice, I think, can be found beyond criminal adjudication. And because of the way criminal adjudication works, I don't think it can always be completely satisfactory. That it almost needs the community to be part of the process for it to be valid somehow or satisfactory. So this is
wonderful. Thank you. The next question, Teresa, is addressed directly to you. But again, as was the case a moment ago, John, you might have some examples from your wealth of knowledge about different kinds of memory projects and other ways of dealing with mass atrocities afterwards. So the question to you comes from Noreen Rahim. And her question is, as part of the Women's Hearing Project, have you followed up with the victims who had taken part earlier? And do you continue the psychosocial support for them afterwards? So if you could elaborate a little bit more about what happens after the initial round of listening, telling and listening.
So I think the psychosocial support started a long time before, and really the NGOs that were providing that across the countries, when they realized you need a coordinator, so someone who can work internationally, like the Liberation War Museum, for example. In this case, I think it was UN Women or maybe GIZ who gave a little bit of seed funding, and that seed funding turned into a coordination money to make sure that while the testimonies are being taken, that the women do have psychosocial support. Then the next question is, do they want to share those publicly in a public hearing where there will be others listening? So there's disclosure. And so that's a different process that needs psychosocial support. And then after they went home, because recalling, I can't stress this enough, how brave survivors are who come forward and tell their stories. You know, any survivor, it's such a act of courage because it really takes a lot out of you. And so we wanted to make sure that they also had support on the other side. But, you know, the more we can work with women such as this, like in Nepal, for example, they're still young and they are still active and actively activist. And there's always possibility to kind of elevate these voices in this issue. So if no one's interested, she should, yeah, this is a perfect time even for working with women, Rohingya women who are in Bangladesh and letting them know they are not the only ones who have gone through what they've gone through. Of course, they had a unique experience, but also there are already women and men, but women mostly, as far as we know from our research at this point, who are already in solidarity with them. So yes.
Great, thank you. John, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Oh, sort of I suppose a personal thing, and that is that what I've noticed being in programs which are dealing with counseling exiting prisoners at the same time I'm in a program with veterans. And so, but anyway, is that the PTSD factor is one that shares in common. At the same time, the other thing I would add is that being in these programs, exercising a kind of support that, frankly, I'm just an ordinary guy, and I don't have that impulse to support as strongly as I have to say it. Most women seem to much more than men. I'm seeing this difference that is being somewhat changed now by these programs which focus on PTSD, because it is something, the counter trauma is shared by both women and men these days, and equally, and therefore we equally share in the effect of being in the training upon us ourselves, being some of the people doing the supporting. And that's one thing I think should be paid attention to as well. I see Teresa nodding as well. I think that's good to see anyway on that.
Well,
I'm very much in agreement as well. Go ahead, Teresa, finish your thought, please.
I was just going to say that I think, especially when it comes to certain kinds of violence, sexual violence in particular, and gender-based violence in particular, it's a continuum. So maybe it's happening at a certain time, but it's definitely, it doesn't go away after the conflict is settled or the genocide subsides. It's still part of the structure of discrimination, marginalization, disempowerment. So there's always room to work on that issue, it seems, until we really have true gender equality and other kinds of equality, racial equality, caste equality. So, this is why justice can't wait for the courts. We need to be producing it all the time in whatever ways we can to contribute. I do want to say that the one caveat here answers the question that's in the chat box, which is such a good one that I'm going to slip it in here. That it always needs to be victim-centric. And even maybe this goes back to the first question. Courts are not victim-centric. They're let's say justice-centric or verdict-centric. But in these cases, when you're asking people to participate, whether it's an oral history or a test or a people's tribunal, they need to be the ones in control, so that, because people have the right to say it's worth the cost of being traumatized and telling the story in order to share it, because that's truth seeking and that's important for history. I will say that almost always victims will say afterwards that it was a relief for them to share, and that is the justice moment. The satisfaction is, I said it, no one called me a liar, no one tried to put me in a corner and punish me for it. I was validated and I was recognized. And that's the moment where we come in as the audience to be producing the kind of just listening that's possible, I think.
Great. Thank you. I'm really grateful you were able to address that question in the chat box and do so just as we run out of time. We're hitting the limit of our panel at 2:00 Eastern Standard Time in the United States, which is very early in the morning for our colleagues in Bangladesh. I would like to thank our speakers for their talks today on the issue of mass atrocities. And I would like to thank everyone who joined us on Facebook or Zoom and for your questions. I hope you're able to enjoy many more panels connected to the conference, and please stay well, remain healthy. My very best to you and yours. Thank you, everyone.